Well, good morning. I'm excited about this. Look, I want to take you back for a little bit as we've been talking about generosity. You guys have been listening to this and learning this, and our students have been in the back sort of doing the same thing. And I know Sam has taken an approach back there with them a little bit where maybe the money worries and everything aren't as significant with them. So we've talked about generosity from a heart standpoint far more than just with their money. But this morning I get the chance to talk to you guys, so I was excited. I'm going to take you back about 22 years. Sharice and I had been married for a few months, right? We got our first real paychecks, all right? Not the little ones from the university, little jobs we were doing, make a minimum wage or whatever it was, but like real paychecks, adult paychecks, and didn't really know what to do with them. Now, look, before you get too excited, they were both first-year teacher paychecks, so in Mississippi, so it wasn't huge, but it was more money than we had ever seen at one time. And so we kind of started talking about what do we do with this, right? Well, here's the deal. It's like, what do we do with all this? I don't know. We will look back and tell you on those times that there are thousands of dollars that are probably unaccounted for. And we didn't do anything crazy. We didn't have a lot of fancy, nice things. We just had no plan for the money, and so we just somehow spent it. I don't know. But when she's asking me, like, what do we do? Like, we're kind of looking at this. What's the first thing we do? And I said, well, you need to write a check for the tithe. And she's like, well, and she didn't grow up tithing. That wasn't something that was part of her life growing up. And so it was mine. It was something that I had always done. And so this is sort of that realization we had that we had never really talked about this in our 3 years of dating, and in even the couple of months we've been married, never really came up. We didn't really have that sort of situation. It was her money and my money, and now it was ours. And so what do we do with this? But here's the deal. When I grew up in my house, whatever I earned, if I went next door and I raked leaves for $5 for the neighbors, 10% went to the church, and then 10% went in my savings. And so I had grown up with this mentality that 10% goes to the church, and then I can do whatever I want with the rest. So tithing, that 10%, it was all I'd ever known, right? And so I just assumed it was all I would ever do. But then even on those small checks, Sharice did the math, and she's like, are you sure about this? This seems like a lot of money to write at one time. And I just told her, I'm very honest, I've never been more sure about anything in my life. I said, just trust me on this one. Like, this is what we need to do. And so she did. And we wrote that check, and we've been writing them ever since. And that sounds spiritual and good, and it is in a lot of ways. You know, my parents taught me what it meant and what it looked like to give the first fruits to the Lord. And then now I'm realizing that I get to pass this on and teach my wife about this, and eventually our family. Now, I would just interject here, I wouldn't recommend waiting till after you're married to sort of have this conversation, because she could have very much not trusted me. She could have very much said, I don't know about this. This doesn't seem smart. If she had not trusted me or not been a believer, it could have gone very badly, right? And then I think really the main point I want you to get of our time today and our first point is that tithing is a great spiritual discipline to have, but I genuinely believe this, that giving is much more desirable than tithing, right? And I would even argue that it could be more God-honoring. And so the question really comes up then, why is that? Because aren't we commanded to give 10%? Well, I'm sure a lot of you are really aware that there's sort of a debate sometimes about, is tithing an Old Testament command? Does it really carry over to the New Testament? And I just would present to you that I think that's really that's a debate that's not really worth having, because it really misses the mark of everything that you guys have heard, everything we've talked to our students about, because tithing or giving is about a generous heart, right? And generous giving is never about the amount, it's about what's in your heart. Because even tithing, when it's done from a legalistic or an obligatory perspective, it really misses the mark on giving with a Christ-like heart. And we should never give out of guilt or compulsion. If you've been here long enough, you've heard our pastor say, as we talk about, it's always that weird thing, we talk about money, there's always somebody here, that's the time you've invited somebody, you're like, no, don't talk about money, But I've heard them as we carefully, our staff so carefully navigated this above and beyond campaign that we went on. Like, we didn't want it to feel like it was just give us money, give us money, give us money. And I've heard our pastors stand in front of our church and say, look, if you feel like we're trying to talk you in some kind of way of giving money to us or guilt you or compel you to do this, then don't give it to us. Don't give it to us. Don't give it to Covenant Church. But pray to the Lord, ask what He would have you give, how He would have you give, and then give to that place or to that person. Like, whatever it is, just be obedient to what God is asking you to give. Again, it's about the heart. It's not about the amount. And so I want to tell you this. I don't think that Sharice and I have ever tithed out of guilt. I was talking to her about this a little bit, and I think that, so that's not where I'm going with this, but I do think that we have always tithed because we felt like it's the way we could honor God. We could thank God for what He's given us, right? And look, that's not to say that we haven't written checks where we weren't sure where grocery money was coming from. That's certainly happened. But as crazy as this sounds, very honestly, God has always shown up. He's always provided for us. We've written that check first, and I don't know if we're going to be able to eat the last 7 days this month, but we're going to trust Him, and He's always provided. And although we didn't and we don't now tithe out of compulsion or guilt, right, what we've found is ourselves in this routine of giving what is required without giving much thought to giving above that amount. And it's not necessarily because we don't want to, right? But as I've reflected and I've thought about this, why is that? I think it's because we just haven't thought about it any other way other than to just give that 10%. And I know that may sound dumb to some of you guys, why would that not occur to you? Maybe some of you are having that same realization now. That's sort of been your thought process. But I want to point something else out to you here. Mom and Dad always told me I could use my money however I wanted, right? I could 10%, and then whatever you have left, bud, it's yours, right? So if I made $5, I knew I was going to have $4 to spend. And that's kind of been my mindset. That sort of, I'm going to give God what's His, gladly give God what's His, never fought that, never doubted that, never questioned that. But whatever I have left, I'm going to spend on what I want, right? So the thought that to give more to God than what Mom and Dad had taught me to give never really crossed my mind growing up. And I wasn't a heathen or anything. It's not what I mean. I just mean that giving God what was His, what I was supposed to give God was just natural. Then I would take the rest and I would spend it on baseball cards or shoes or whatever was on my mind and whatever I was into at the time. And I think there was something there, and I think it's sort of still there in some ways, that it feels almost like we're just checking a box. And I don't mean checking a box necessarily in a completely bad way, but checking a box because that's the routine that we've been in. That's what we've done. That's how we give. But I've never really had a box that existed on my to-do list to give God more than what I've been taught He deserved or wanted or asked from us. And so that's sort of where we ended up, right? It's easy to call it all God's money when you only give Him what you feel like you have to. And so the author of this book that we've been using, Randy Acorn, says that tithing isn't the ceiling of giving, it's the floor. It's not the finish line of giving, it's the starting blocks. He says that tithes can launch us into the mindset, skills, and habits of grace giving. And in Malachi 3:8, we see what happens here is the Israelites really, they rob God by withholding not only these free will gift offerings, but they're withholding their mandatory tithes, right? This is Old Testament time. This is what they were commanded to give. There's no doubt about that. And if God is so upset with them about this, right, setting aside their tithe and foregoing their offerings altogether, right, we should see that God still cares about His people's giving today. And so when we give, and we give out of a heart of grace giving, right, that's more desirable than tithing. So I want to look at 2 Corinthians 9:10 through 11. If you guys will turn there with me. So in 2 Corinthians 9:10 through 11, it says, "He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. So my second point today is this: we are enriched in every way to be generous in every way. And so we need to remember that God doesn't prosper us to raise our standard of living. He prospers us to raise our standard of giving. So just as I mentioned earlier with grocery money always showing up, right? Or extra little bit always being there. Because I'm telling you right now, if you went back and did some forensic accounting of our checking account, I guarantee you that God has done some fishes and loaves type of stuff in that account. I mean, you go back and look and you're like, that wasn't there. There's some supernatural stuff happening there. As a side note, Sharice used to make this chicken casserole, and she stayed home for 2 years, and we lived off just my salary. And she would go from like this, lots of several chicken breasts in the casserole to she was making it with just one. And I can remember coming home one night, and I was like, "Babe, you splurged. You went with 2 chicken breasts tonight." And she's like, "No, it's just one." I'm like, God is multiplying these chicken breasts when you put it in the oven. And that's a true story. I think little things like that happen over and over again. And I think to a large extent because we were faithful in giving, even though our mindset may not have been to give more. Guys, God doesn't just provide for us to meet some minimum standard of living. He gives us more than we need so that we can give and that we can give generously. But see, it's our sinful nature, right? Here we go. It causes us to convince ourselves that we've earned something, that we deserve what God has given us. And see, we have to remember that we just don't deserve it. God's given us more than we need so that we can be generous in giving back to Him and we give to others as well. Most of you in here know that one of my daughters, Caroline, has been on several mission trips. And on all of those, I've gone back to, I guess, the second time she went to Haiti. She's raised her own money for these trips. And she's sold T-shirts, and we've asked for help online or whatever. But a couple summers ago, she spent this summer amongst Somali refugees in Kansas City. And so she gets this opportunity, and we're like, I don't know. I think it's going to cost us $2,500 or whatever. And the money never really was the problem for us. It was sending my daughter that was just finished her sophomore year to live somewhere with people that we didn't know, in an area we didn't know and had never been. But Sharice and I prayed about it. We talked through it. We decided to let her go. And I can remember we were on a college visit tour. We were in Oxford, and we were headed to Tuscaloosa and then Baton Rouge. And we were in Oxford that night. We decided to do it. We let my in-laws know so they wouldn't be caught off guard by posting on Facebook. But we posted the giving link. And that was about 10 p.m. that night. And we woke up at 8 the next morning, and she had about $3,000 already pledged that we only needed $2,500. Those things happened over and over again. The following summer, she spent the summer in Nepal, did the same thing. The same thing happened, having to raise $4,500 or $5,000. And so when we had to do things like that, or we've had to ask, it's never been an issue. And I say that to tell you this. We did in that money that's been donated. Several of you in this room have donated to her cause, and I'm not going to call you out because you'd probably be upset about that. But here's the deal. We had some friends that don't go to church here. We had some parents of football players that I've coached in the past who are very extremely wealthy, who gave to her trip. And they certainly made it much easier for us. We saw those big chunks coming in. And I'll be honest with you, those were great because I felt like they were given because they loved me, they loved my family. Maybe not there, maybe they're not super spiritual or super religious or anything, but they loved my family, they loved my kids, and they gave. What really got to me and Sharice was looking at that list and seeing some of your names, bless you, seeing names of people who we know are financially very, very similar to us, who have enough, but maybe not, and we look at the amount they give, and I'm in my mind, my first thing is they can't afford to give that. And that changed how we saw everything. It was unbelievable to see that, to see so many of them who were giving generously, right? And so we have to understand, right, that God gives to us so that we can in turn give generously. And again, I want to make sure you hear this. I'm not just talking about you writing a check or going online and giving to Covenant Church. God may lead you to give, in a number of places. And I also want to point this out just so I don't forget, is that like Sharice and I talk about that mindset of like this minimal tithe giving. We've given to things like that. We've had students over the years that have gone on mission trips, whatever else. So when people ask, like, I feel like we've been able to be generous, but it's not been our mindset. It's not been the base mindset for us to say, we need to give more than what this 10% tithe is. So we want to give generously. So why? So our third point then today is this: because generous giving opens us to a deeper experience, of God's grace. It opens us to a deeper experience of God's grace. Paul says that God provides the seed to us so that we can sow, and that by doing that sowing, we will increase the harvest of righteousness. He's simply saying that the riches that God gives us enable us to sow more generously, which in turn then yields this harvest of righteousness. He says that when we're open to giving eagerly and willingly, even above what we tithe or what we can think we can get, what we think we can or that we should give, that in turn will deepen our experience of God's grace. It frees us from this grasp of fixating on money and the material things of this world. Because here's what I think, and I think we all know this and would probably agree with this. This world has too strong a grip on our flesh, right? Material possessions and money hold this spell over us. And we don't like to admit it, but on some level it exists in all of us. Because it could be nice cars, it could be jewelry, it could be shoes. Maybe it's fancy vacations or nice restaurants. Whatever it is, and it's something in all of us, each of us has something that we hold on to that sort of holds this sway over us when it comes to how we spend our money or how we give our money or how we choose not to give our money. Guys, it could be something like saving for college for your kids or for a car when they're ready to drive, right? Which I don't think anyone in this room would argue is a bad thing to save for, to hold on to your money. Look, yeah, I'll give you something crazy. We were worried about paying for college. We did a terrible job, as in not at all, as saving for college. We just banked on the fact that our kids would be smart. It was a real worry. And then Gracie decided, I want to go to Alabama. You don't even want to know what out-of-state tuition costs at Alabama. It's enough that we couldn't, there was not enough student loans she could take out to pay for it if she didn't get scholarships. And we prayed, that's where she's supposed to be, but we can't afford it, you can't afford it, we're not going to do this. God's got to provide this. And so we prayed and we prayed and we prayed. And guys, here's the deal. We were worried. We were really worried. But God provided. God showed up in a huge way. And He provided for us in that sense that they could all go to college where they wanted to, study what they wanted to and where they wanted to. And He provided for all three of them with jobs on campus so they can help out. He provided for us a way to be able to do that. And He provided these scholarships. And He continues to do that. Even after they've enrolled in college, we've got notifications of well, here's another scholarship. Yeah, you get this. And so we're looking at that, and it's just been unbelievable. And so naturally, right, I show incredible gratitude, and I shift from this worry to trust. Except that's not true, because now I spend a huge chunk of my day worrying about paying for 2 weddings in a couple of years. Because we have friends who are going through planning the wedding for their daughter. And they're, we're 10 grand into this and we haven't done this and we're looking at 25 or 30 grand. And all I can do is be sick to my stomach thinking about paying for 2 of them. And so the thing is this, right? They're good things. College is a good thing. Weddings are a good thing. But these good things have a hold on I can't afford to give this money away because I've got to pay for a wedding in a couple of years. It's this closed-minded mentality, and I just have been praying for the last month or two, even before we started this, God, give me open hands. Don't let me worry about this. See, the problem is not the things. It's not the whatever it may be, college, money, jewelry, whatever. It's not the things. The problem is that we fixate on those things. And it's our obsession, right, with somehow obtaining those things or holding on to those things. The problem is not the things, it's that we won't choose generosity over our own selfish wants. We deem them as needs or musts, and we do whatever we can to save for those or to buy those or to have those now instead of giving generously and trusting that God always provides. You go back and look to the history of the Bible and the promises that God has always kept His promises. We know this to be true. I know this to be true. Intellectually, I believe this to be true. But when I hold on to anything at all, like that I can't give this away, I can't let someone have this, I can't give this money away because I can't afford then, and like, do I not really trust that in 5 years that God's going to do the same thing that He did for my kids to go to college? As we're worried about that, do I not trust the exact same thing? And when we do this, how does it affect us, right? The author of the book here says, if we fulfill our obligation to God first, we invite His blessing to help us pay our debts to people. But when we rob God to pay people, we rob ourselves of God's blessing. And he describes it as this vicious cycle. He says the only way to break that cycle is obedient faith. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 8:3, and he talks about the Macedonians here. He says, for they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. These Macedonians were not just given what they were capable of giving, they were giving until it hurt. They were given beyond what any human would have said, that's good. Hey, God's good with that, man, I promise you. They were going beyond that. They were giving in a radically generous way. Same author says, it's much easier, this is a little bit convicting here for me as I read it, it's much easier to live on 90% or 50% or even 10% of your income inside of God's will than it is to live on 100% outside of God's will. Look, clearly, even in this room, in this small room, a lot of us are very, very similar. We live in the same type areas and same type homes. Even with that, most of our incomes are different. Some of us are able to, our tithe is higher or lower than someone else's. We don't have as much money, right? Some of you have not a lot of money, and some of us teach and we're balling out, so we're good there, right? But look, although our incomes are different, right? Some of us can give more than others. It doesn't stop any of us from taking part in giving to God generously. So I want to give you 2 practical ways you can increase your standard of giving today. The first is real simple. If you aren't tithing, start now. If you aren't tithing, then start now. Right? I believe that it should go to your church, but I would agree with Luke and Jason when they've said these things, that if you think that we're just saying this to get your money, you want that Christmas offering, you want to do this or that, then give it where God wants you to. Give it to the hub. Give it somewhere else. Give it somewhere where God's telling you to give it. But just give. It's not about where, my kids, they're in college now and they're involved in churches there. Dad, where do we tithe our money? I don't care. Well, I said, give it to Ole Miss Crew. You go there all the time, like do that. Give it to your church in Tuscaloosa. Give it to Covenant Church. Whatever, just give. Just make sure you're continuing to do that. But whatever it is, just give. All right? Because here's a question. If you lost 10% of your salary today, would you die? So here's the deal. So right now, by saying no, you've admitted that it won't kill you. You've admitted that it's not that you can't do it, it's that you won't do it. Right? So now you can admit it's just a matter of not wanting to, and you can start doing that. Secondly, if you're already tithing, I would encourage you to prayerfully consider grace giving. Talk with your spouse about what you want to give above the tithe. And Sharice and I talked a little bit about this. Is it maybe just going to 15%, right? Maybe just a 5% offering every month. And you start looking at that, and for an average income, right, you're like, well, that's a car note, that's a whatever, right? Like I could do this much with that. You got to pray about it, and you've got to decide with that intent of going up every year, of giving more. So maybe that you are at some point. Could you imagine living off 50% of your salary and giving 50% away? It could be an extra amount every paycheck. Maybe it's not a percentage. I'm just going to take an extra $50, I'm going to give it, right? Maybe it's every other paycheck. Whatever it is, I don't know, but I would encourage you to pray about that and then obey and how God's leading you to give. I may not know a lot of things, but I can guarantee that you can't give too much. It's not like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, right? Like, I promise you that you can't outgive God. So I want to close with this. I mentioned that Sharice and I really hadn't, I don't want to speak for her, I guess, but I hadn't really ever considered or thought, right? About giving more on a regular basis, right? Outside of some special occasion. And then we came to Covenant Church in August of 18, I think is what it was. We really began to see something different. And it was really that first Christmas when they got up and they were talking about the Christmas offering. And I think the goal that year was, Luke, I don't remember, it was 10,000 or 15. It was all I do. I remember this. I remember looking around, spending a couple of months in the church. I wasn't leading the youth. I wasn't even involved with the youth. Our kids were going back there. Sharice and I were just trying to be together and heal at that point. But I remember looking around and literally thinking, what a bunch of idiots. There's like 30 people in this room. There's no way they're getting to $10,000. Right? Like I'm telling you guys, I remember like literally Sharice and I walking out going, oh, these people are crazy. And now we're one of those people who are crazy. Right? Because here's the deal. Like I mean, if you looked around that room that day, it might as well have been asking for $1 million. It didn't matter if it was 10 or 15. There's no way we were getting to that amount. A few weeks later, I found out that we had not only met that goal, but had exceeded that goal. And then I started looking around thinking, there's some rich people in this room. Like, maybe they could give to Benton football, you know, like what's going on here? Because I knew that little bit we had given did not push anybody over $10,000, right? But I watched again the next years. As each year we increased that amount, right? And our goal just every year seemed to be this seemingly just, it's impossible number. But after that first year and second year, I really stopped doubting, and I just kind of was just looking forward to like, what crazy number are we going to set this year? Like, what are we going to do? And it's unbelievable. But I've just been able to kind of sit and stand amazed, right, at what God has done to this small body of believers who were just willing to be obedient with their money. And I realized at some point, one Christmas Eve, we were tearing down. I was pulling the curtains down. And it occurred to me as we talked about giving that I mentioned one of my daughters doing a lot of mission trips and she feels called to be overseas. It occurred to me that this far-reaching generosity, that could be her one day. That could be our church sending money to support her work in the mission field. Like the generosity goes much further than we could ever think or imagine. Maybe they won't go to support her. I don't know. That's not what I'm asking. That's not what I'm saying. But I know this, that when we give generously, God uses all of it for His kingdom. I looked around that Sunday, that first Christmas, and I just laughed at the audacity to think that a church so small could give so much. Just this morning, man, I pray that you would never doubt the generosity of God's people. I pray that you would never doubt the capability of the generosity of our own hearts. And may we always be more generous than anyone thinks possible. Let's pray. Father, we love you and we thank you so much for all that you've given to us. God, I pray that we would be incredible stewards of this money, not just to tithe, but to give above that. God, would we always remember that just because you put money in our hands doesn't mean you want it to stay there. So God, would we give generously from generous hearts? Would we give, God, you promise us you can do above and beyond anything we could ever think or imagine. Would we give above and beyond anything that anyone else thinks is reasonable to think or imagine? God, I pray that we would seek you in what we should give and how we should give, and that we would give generously, not just during Christmas time, but all throughout the year. God, we love you. So in your name we pray. Amen.